Center. One thing I think that's just worth noting, right, at the outset right here, is that we are both very much bipartisan, right? Obviously, the Bipartisan Policy Center needs no introduction, right? It's a DC-based think tank that actively is fostering bipartisanship through any number of ways. The Alliance for Securing Democracy is a bipartisan transatlantic initiative housed at the German Marshall Fund. And part of the reason we came together, right, both of our orgs did to do this report is because we've recognized, right, that right now there's a Republican in the White House, right? There's a Senate that's obviously majority Republican, and there's a House that's obviously Democratic-led. And so if there's going to be any kind of action that occurs, at least at the federal level, right, there's going to be bipartisanship that's needed. And Matt will obviously get to talk about this more, but quite frankly, even if this weren't the case, generally, if there have been election changes made in the past, they've often required at least a sheen of bipartisanship to go through. A couple exceptions there, but that at least partially explains, right, why the two of our organizations got together. Matt, if you don't mind going to the next one. Why was this paper created, right, 20 for 20? You know, I think it's worth noting there are three things that I think are really important, right, as in terms of why we did this. And there are a couple of others, but I just want to touch on three. Number one, right, there is a bipartisan consensus that states will need more dedicated election security funding to protect themselves and prepare for the remaining 2020 elections, including defending the presidential election against attempts to undermine it, right? Obviously, as many are here aware, right, many in the law enforcement and intelligence community toward the end of last year, right, indicated that foreign actors, including but not limited to China, Russia, and Iran, would attempt to interfere. We've obviously seen some of that play out since in the 2020 election cycle. But in addition to foreign interference, right, we've seen a number of other things come into play, right? The coronavirus pandemic being one, civil unrest in recent weeks, you know, highlighted by, I think, some responses and reactions following, right, George Floyd's death being another. And so what we do know and what folks recognize at the local, state, and even right across many, many organizations is that we need more election security funding. Obviously, in March, there was $400 million that was put out or approved by Congress. But the bottom line is we need more than that. Number two, what this paper was also about was to underscore and highlight the fact that in the past, right, in 2018 and 2019, right, Congress did provide election security grants, and there were a number of innovative and effective ways in which states spent that money. And so for those folks that have concerns about, you know, if we provide states and local election officials with more money, will it be spent well, right? We wanted to underscore that not only is there a need for more money, but if past this prologue, that in fact the money would be spent and could be spent well. And then finally, right, one of the things that we touch on in this report and what we do is we bring up, right, and highlight a number of really good practices that different states have done, right, not only for Congress's sake, but also for other states' sake as well. Matt, of course, will touch on this as well, but it's worth underscoring that, of course, here in the U.S., right, our elections, right, the primacy of which are at the state level, and obviously there are many, many duties that are done at the local level as well. And so the result is that you've obviously got different practices depending on what state and, frankly, what locality you go to. Matt, can we go to the next one? And so let's get into it, right? Obviously, right, this paper is 20 for 20. What Matt and I are going to attempt to do in fairly short order, Matt was very good in our prep call about reminding me about this, so I'm going to stick to it, was we're going to be tight because we want to make sure that, frankly, we want to hit the high points and then open it up for questions, your good questions, quite frankly. So let's get right into it, right? The first one that we indicated in terms of our recommendations was developing and conducting more frequent threat assessments, right? One of the things I think that's really important is that discussions of election security often focus on individual aspects of the process or election system. It can be voting machines, right? It could be voter registration databases. And while these are important, right, it's really important to look at the election process as a whole, understand the interaction of election systems and personnel, and assess the vulnerabilities that exist in each facet that, right, could be exploited by malicious actors looking to undermine elections, or frankly, right, could be opportunities for mistakes to be made, right? And so, you know, one of the things that we talk about right at the outset is being able to conduct, right, threat assessments on a more regular basis, right, with additional funding that would help state and local election officials implement mitigation strategies where weaknesses are identified, right? And the cost isn't necessarily super prohibitive. And so we wanted to make sure and start at the outset with developing and conducting more frequent threat assessments. And the following 19 recommendations, frankly, in many respects, are going to be sort of examples of what we mean there. Next one, Matt. One of the things that we want to have, that we touch on here, that we want to, that could be done with more money from Congress, is hiring additional cybersecurity staff, right? We recognize that that for states that have invested in staff recruitment and retention, that can bolster election security by assisting state and local election officials with any number of security related things, including security incident management and response, threat and vulnerability management, risk management, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, it's not just that this is sort of boilerplate language that is useful. We've seen states act and do this kind of thing, right? We saw the state of Michigan at the end of last year hire their first ever state election security specialist. We saw the state of Ohio, right, under Secretary of State LaRose, right, hire a chief security election officer in the Secretary of State's office, right? Both in Ohio and Michigan, these folks at the state level help, frankly, organize, right, and oversee election security efforts. And we also have seen, right, in Iowa, right, Secretary of State Pate also bring on a chief election security officer, right? And it can be really helpful to have someone there who is doing any number of things, right? That can be a matter of, again, coordinating your overall security plan. That can be providing training, right, to state and local election officials. It can also be about, frankly, coordinating information sharing between state, local, and federal officials. And so some states have already begun doing this. Obviously, if Congress can provide more money, we think there are more states that could do this really critical action. Next, Matt. You know, we couldn't have done this report with at least touching on, right, obviously the coronavirus at least a little bit. So we're going to touch on it in at least a couple of slides. One of the things that we touch on here is that you want to make sure, and that one of the reasons that states and localities need more money is to mitigate the potential risks associated with administering more vote by mail due to the coronavirus, right? One of the things that the National Academy of Sciences touched on, that we touch on here in this slide and in our report, is that, you know, and Matt is very good about underscoring this, is that in some respects, right, vote by mail can present more opportunities for votes to be lost, tampered with, or intercepted than in-person voting. It's really important to underscore, though, right, that there's nothing to suggest, right, that vote by mail, right, is subject to widespread fraud, right, or has substantial or significant vulnerabilities, right? What's important for us in this report to lay out is that there are potentials, right, for different vulnerabilities. And so it's really important, right, that states are providing, right, guidance to localities about that, and that steps are being taken to mitigate those potential risks. And one of the examples that we held up, right, is the state of Washington, right, where each ballot envelope has a unique barcode and tracking system that election officials and voters can use to monitor a ballot's progress via an online portal. And that's really important, right? Because obviously if you have something like that and there are delays that seem unusual to you, you obviously have a way as a voter of being able to go and check and see, right, whether or not there's just simply a little bit of a delay or maybe there's something else going on. Frankly, if Congress can provide more money so that, right, so that as many states as possible have something like that, that could be really helpful. It's worth also noting, and I'm only going to do this obviously in a couple of respects, but, you know, we obviously wrote this report and put it out, you know, at the end of May. Obviously, there were June 2nd primary elections that took place. You know, Matt may touch on that a little bit here, right? But one thing that I think is really important to note that we saw in a couple of states in June 2nd, right, obviously, were some trouble spots that we had, right? We saw delays in mail. We also saw that at least in one jurisdiction, one of the responses to dealing with that sort of some of the challenges with voting by mail was resorting to emailing out some ballots, right? And while I think the DC Board of Elections, of course, I think had the best of intentions, that introduces and can introduce obviously some additional, right, security risks, and that's underscores part of the reason why we have this recommendation. Next slide, Matt. We want to make sure, right, that all election officials in the state are using multi-factor authentication, right? And that, you know, as part of that, right, that they're adding layers of security, which are imperative, right, when accessing data, sensitive data or systems, right? And that it can include election officials' social media accounts and voter registration databases, which Russian government, right, affiliated cyber actors targeted in the run-up to the 2016 elections. You know, this is a really, really sort of important piece. There are an increasing number of state and local election officials that are using multi-factor authentication, but there could be more. And so that's obviously, again, another thing that with additional funds, right, potentially more and more folks could be able to adopt. Next slide. All right. The next slide that we've got that we want to talk about here is helping local election officials adopt HTTPS website security measures, right? You know, we touch on it. We'll touch on it here, and then Matt will touch on .gov. You know, just to give folks a sense, HTTPS is a standard security protocol that frankly makes it much harder, right, for an adversary to hijack a website and provide false information, right? And in a recent survey of county websites and county election administration websites in the 13 states that were projected as battlegrounds in this November's presidential election, right, a majority lacked HTTPS website security measures. This is something that has been raised by the Department of Homeland Security, right? This has been something that's been raised by the National Association of Secretaries of State. This is going in the right direction for states and localities, but there are more who can take this kind of action. Next slide. Recommendation number 6 is to assist state and local election officials with maintaining safe cybersecurity practices while transitioning from offices to remote workstations, right? One of the things I think that we've all recognized here, right, as a result of the coronavirus pandemic is that organizations all over the world are scrambling to purchase and set up remote workstations for employees. And of course, election officials are no exception, right? And in our report, we touch briefly on a couple of things that folks can do to try and mitigate risks associated with that. We talk about having each election official that has remote access to a work computer to have a secure virtual private network, right? And we also talk about employees receiving training on safe work from home practices to ensure greater protection of sensitive information while working remotely. And I think, you know, just to sort of touch on this a little more, this is a really sort of important slide, right? Because we see that there are a number of activities, right, that can be impacted, right, by this. We know that, right, changes to work environments, if not properly managed, can create new targets for those interested in disrupting American elections. You know, one example, right, that's sort of, that we didn't touch on here, but is another example, is that many employees who would need to access voter registration databases, right, are working at home or away from their normal work sites during the pandemic. And this creates, right, this additional pressure could create new targets for those interested in disrupting elections through ransomware or other cyber attacks. And so, again, we'll be touching a little more on ransomware further on down, but I just wanted to add that point too. Next slide. Slide number 7 is we want to make sure, and one of the other things that we laid out is that we want Congress to be providing additional money, right, so that states can take additional steps to prevent voter registration databases from ransomware attacks, right? Ransomware attacks are one of the biggest challenges that folks are worried about, right, from the Department of Homeland Security down to states and down to local officials as well. And I think that's for good reason, right? Just to give folks a sense about what we mean by that, right? I think one of the things, just so folks who aren't familiar with ransomware know, is that ransomware is a type of malicious software that's designed to block access to a computer system until a sum of money is paid, right? And what we know is that increasing mail voting as a result of the pandemic can require increased attention to the resiliency of the voter registration databases, particularly in the lead up to key election dates, right? And that means, I think for as we think about that, right, local election officials should consider backing up an electronic copy of voter information on a daily basis, right? So that they have the most recent information, right, in the event that there were a ransomware attack. It's also worth noting, right, we include, of course, a few things in our report. We talk about that, if possible, right, like Illinois, states could include moving voter registration databases to a dedicated network, though we recognize that at this juncture, that frankly may be just a bit too much of a challenge. But we also ask and talk about requiring that states and localities if they could get additional funds, they could offer additional security awareness training for election officials, right? And provide funding for improved devices and or software. Next, Matt. One of the other reasons why we're hopeful, right, that Congress can provide additional money, right, is we recognize the importance of being able to conduct a proactive voter education campaign. One of the things I think that's really important is previously, right, to the coronavirus pandemic, you can see on the slide, you can see that frankly, a lot of Americans expressed concern, right, about how prepared we were for the November 2020 presidential election. They also frankly expressed concern about their own ability to tell fact from fiction or to tell the difference between truth and misleading information. And they indicated that it would frankly be harder to identify deceptive information in this election than it was in 2016. And obviously folks many of the folks here on this call are aware about, right, Russia's efforts in some cases, right, its real successes in being able to disrupt aspects of the 2016 presidential election. And so I think part of what's important about this is that if there can be additional money provided by Congress, right, states and localities could have the ability to conduct very robust, proactive voter education campaigns. And that could include, right, frankly, explaining the steps that they're taking, right, to try and make sure that they're securing the election in this environment, right? And whether that's talking to folks about, right, what they're doing to prepare for the surge in vote by mail, whether that's talking about what they're doing to try and secure, right, and make safe their in-person voting, or what they're doing to prepare and contingency plan in the event that there's something that goes unexpectedly on election day. We think getting that information out in advance to voters can provide voters a sense, in some respects, of calm, but also give voters a sense of understanding, right? We want folks to know that if in fact results come in a little later for this presidential election than maybe in previous years, right, that folks understand that that isn't necessarily a sign that there's a concern about the integrity of the election. It may be, for example, that processing and tabulating vote by mail ballots just takes a little bit longer. Next slide there, Matt. One of the other things that one of the other reasons we wanted to sort of ask for, right, Congress to provide more money was, again, to identify another really good state practice, right? One of those really good state practices was the cyber navigation program, right, created by the state of Illinois, right? Obviously, probably as many folks on this call are aware, in 2016, after, right, hackers affiliated with the Russian government, right, successfully penetrated its voter registration database, it was Illinois that started, right, a cyber navigator program employing cybersecurity experts with responsibility for geographic zones across the state, right, to work with election officials to conduct comprehensive risk assessments of each jurisdiction. And this is a really sort of groundbreaking program that we've seen other states do, whether it's Minnesota or a handful of, a number of other states do. And it's really important for a couple of reasons, right? Cyber navigators have a real expertise, right, on these kinds of issues that in some cases, right, state and local election officials either don't have the bandwidth and or the expertise, number one. Number two, right, these cyber navigators are going to come in and not only, right, be able to sort of provide an assessment of what's good and what could use improvement, right, but obviously be able to talk through, right, what might be needed, right, to make certain improvements with regards to a state or local election official's cyber posture. And so, obviously this is something, again, that we think, right, with additional funds, we could see more state and local election officials doing. All right, next, Matt. And then the final example I'll go through before turning it over to Matt is that it's really important. We feel that there could be more, right, state and local officials that are using a social media monitoring service or tool to help fight disinformation and or misinformation efforts. Right, obviously, as folks are aware here, right, we began to see a real proliferation here in the United States of both disinformation as well as misinformation. Particularly right in the 2016, in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. Right, the example that you see on your screen, of course, is what Colorado did, right, in trying both to put out accurate information and then obviously being able to respond to, right, inaccurate information. There are other examples. Again, right, our report, right, was 20 examples, and we, of course, wanted it to be user-friendly and reader-friendly. So we obviously, tried to be as concise as we could be, but we've seen, there are other tools. For example, MITRE has a tool called Squint, right, that they've put out that sort of is an app that's partially about being able to right, something that local and state election officials could get that they could theoretically use to be able to highlight, right, mis or disinformation. And then obviously they might have an opportunity to be able to figure out how best to respond to it. But whatever tool you might consider doing, I think it's really important, right, that state and local election officials can be alerted as quickly as possible to dis or misinformation so that, right, they can help mitigate as best as possible, right? Whether or not that's putting a correction on social media, whether that's putting out a statement to the media, we want to make sure that voters obviously have the correct information about where, when, and how to vote, among other things. All right, Matt, over to you.
All right, well, thank you, David. That was very helpful. And I really appreciate being here tonight. I really am not lying when I say there are very few topics that I wouldn't enjoy talking about more. So I'll talk about elections anytime, anywhere. That includes Sunday night. So I'm happy to be here. I also want to thank David for coming to me. I mean, Alliance for Security and Democracy was the prime driver on this report, and I was really happy that he came to the Bipartisan Policy Center to look for a partner in putting it out. So I'm going to be really quick with my 10 slides because I really do agree with David that we can do a lot more with the questions that you guys have than talking at you. But before I say that, I will say, the past 4 years since 2016, we've seen a very big swing towards a focus on election security. And certainly a lot of that was in response to what happened in 2016, and I understand why it happened. Before 2020's pandemic hit, I was one of those people who was out there saying we have to be a little careful. We are going too far in security, and we aren't focusing on some of the other problems. And I think some of those other issues have been raised now by the coronavirus, which is, some of the, weaknesses in some of our alternative voting methods, our registration systems, which have been knocked offline because people can't go to the DMV anymore. So election security, very important. Now we've kind of shifted and swung the pendulum to other things. And now we may have moved too far away from security for elections. So finding that happy medium is important. And David alluded to the fact that in the FY18 and the FY20 election security grants, totaling about $805 million, Congress really wanted to focus on election security. And I'll note, and we can talk about this in the questions, a lot of that money is yet to be spent. Some of it's been spent, but not all of it. And one of the biggest complaints we hear from Congress is, well, they're not spending it fast enough, so they don't need any more. And I disagree with that premise completely. I think that states aren't spending a lot of it because, as you'll note, a lot of the things that David talked about were personnel heavy, and states have a tough time hiring new personnel if they can't identify long-term funding for that. So, I do think the immediate influx is needed. Both it was needed in 18 and 20, and again with the Emergency CARES Act funding of $400 million the past earlier this year in response to the coronavirus. But there needs to be a longer conversation about how we're going to fund our elections, both security and the administrative processes for the long term. So with that, let me pick up on 11. So assist local election officials with assessing and improving their physical election security. Again, this is one of those things that many people have kind of forgotten about because all of the 2016 energy was focused on cybersecurity and hacking. But at the end of the day, just getting the physical security locked down in many jurisdictions is key. I think that when people think elections, they think the big jurisdictions, the 50 biggest counties or the 50 biggest cities, and certainly there are a lot of voters there. But since we are so decentralized, there are so many elections offices that have 1 or 2 employees. Most of the time, they're not full-time employees, and this is like a third or fourth thing on their plate. Making sure they have the resources to actually just lock the voting systems up at night is something that would be pretty important, and people are shocked that that's not even happening in every place. So that's a key. The DHS has some tools to help jurisdictions with their physical security, and there's just really a need of resources to get them there. On 12, so helping local election officials work with Facebook and Twitter to be identified as trusted sources. So Facebook and Twitter have been in the news a lot. I know you guys are going to be talking about this on the Secure Elections Network on a future webinar. The fact of the matter is election officials can't ignore Facebook and Twitter. Voters are getting huge percentages of their information from both. The problem is it's really hard to know who's who. Most people do not know who their Secretary of State is. I would venture to guess that most people don't know the Secretary of State is the chief election officer in 40 states. If you're in one of those 10 states that doesn't have a Secretary of State as a chief election officer, most likely those voters don't know where to go either. So we really need to do better on integrating Facebook and Twitter, and Facebook and Twitter to all of the problems they have kind of going on right now. They have been working with election officials to try to raise up those voices to make sure those election officials can be trusted sources of information. And the National Association of Secretaries of State, NAS, does have a program which is Trusted Info 2020. VPC is a part of that. And the whole idea is to make sure voters are getting the information, the right information from the right people, and they know about that. One of the ways to do that is to make sure they are getting verified on Facebook and Twitter. Again, David talked about the voter registration databases a little earlier with ransomware. We'll readily admit this is probably not something that they can do with the time remaining in 2020. But we can't forget that the state voter registration databases were the vectors of attack, primarily, at least on the hardened infrastructure in 2016. We know that at least 21 states, although I think the thinking is that there's more than that, had their databases scanned, probed, whatever term you want to use. We know in a couple cases they did breach those databases, and everything we know publicly is that they didn't do anything. Now that's a little bit disconcerting. I think the Senate Intelligence Committee said it best. Why didn't they do anything? Was it a test run? Were they trying to do something more in 2020? We don't know what they were trying to do, or maybe they're just seeing what they could get away with. So I think we certainly want to make sure that states are securing those vectors of attack that have been attacked in the past. A couple ways to do that. One of the ways that I've seen out there, and a couple states are toying with this and is trying to work with this, there is some software out there, some programs that help states know when there have been unauthorized changes to their databases. We certainly encourage more of that. Strengthening EPB or electronic poll book procedures. The EPBs are important. They've been important for a while. They've been around for a while. States have and jurisdictions have a couple of different ways to go about using them. Some are created in-house, some are through vendors. Some are connected live to statewide databases on election day, some are not. Certainly focusing on some of those procedures is pretty important and essential in any election. It may even be more important in this election though, now that we have a bunch of states moving towards vote centers for election day and away from their neighborhood polling places. Certainly we don't recommend during a presidential election year states do dramatic changes to their voting process. However, because of the coronavirus, because of the fact that states are ramping up vote by mail and they still want to provide an in-person voting option, it is likely we're going to see some sort of consolidation of polling places throughout the country. Either people will be assigned to larger vote centers where they have to go to those specific vote centers, and it's just a consolidation of precincts into one location. Or in the more progressive areas, they may try to have 5 or 6 vote centers for an entire jurisdiction. Anyone in that jurisdiction can go to any of those vote centers. That requires some interconnectivity of the poll books, and so strengthening those procedures up front would be very helpful. Ensuring that the local election officials have enough provisional ballots and related materials on hand. Again, this is another thing that I think is going to be very important, even more so during voting during a pandemic. What we've seen in the jurisdictions that have tried to run somewhat or some level of in-person voting during the past couple of months, a lot of the people who are showing up at the in-person voting sites are people who did not get their absentee ballot. Either they requested it late or the mail didn't get to them. In a lot of states, those people end up getting tags in the database, the statewide database, as having an absentee ballot. In some states, if they bring that ballot and they cancel it at the polling place, they can still vote a regular ballot. In many jurisdictions, though, that indication means that they can't vote anything but a provisional ballot. So I think that making sure that the polling places, whatever they look like, vote centers or whatever, have enough backup ballots for an expected influx of people who need to replace those ballots. Conducting a post-election tabulation audit. If you asked me back in February, before this pandemic got real, what was likely to be one of the big stories of 2020, I probably would have said post-election tabulation audits. And we've been talking about these audits for a long time, and I thought we were going to see a huge number of them this year, and I think we are going to see a huge number of them this year. But I do think that it's going to get overshadowed by a lot of other things that are going on, unfortunately. These audits, typically on paper ballots, the most common one or the most popular one is a risk limiting audit. The whole idea is to verify that the count is accurate. And there's a lot of promise there. They are highly statistical. I think that jurisdictions are learning how to talk about them so that voters have the same confidence in the outcome of these tabulation audits as election officials do. But I think that these audits hold a huge promise for restoring a little bit of trust and the confidence in the outcome of elections. 17 is following the 2020 primary elections, conducting statewide tabletop exercises to prepare for the general. Obviously, practice makes perfect. There's a lot going on right now, but we still think that the primary elections are going to provide election officials with a lot of evidence about what could happen in the fall. And so trying to game out some of the most likely scenarios, but honestly, there are any number of scenarios that have been proposed by groups like mine, a whole bunch of other groups out there, Belfer Center at Harvard. There are a couple that are being done by the American Press Institute. I do think that planning for the unknown is key. And I know David's been a part of some of these. When you go to these tabletop exercises and people are in a room together or virtually, as it's going to be this year, and they're hit with a simulation, seeing how they respond is some of the best ways to actually get some experience before it hits the fan this fall. 18 is helping localities transition all government websites, including election sites, to .gov domains. This is kind of a shocking thing that a lot of government entities down to the local level do not use .gov. It is not prohibitively expensive. And again, in our era where it's really hard to know what is true, you need to have elections offices on .gov. Now, there are a couple different reasons why that hasn't happened yet. I will note that in a previous life, I was on the research team at the Election Assistance Commission. That was a long time ago. I was there from 2008 to 2011. One of the reports I worked on at that time was about election websites. And so this is not a new issue. We knew about it then. And it's still 10 years on, hasn't been resolved. I do think that this all comes down to, again, the trusted sources of information. Voters need to know where to go. Going to a .com is something that they've kind of been conditioned to not necessarily trust when it comes to governmental information. 19 is acquiring the most current secure operating system available. Again, this is one of those ones that I think people are shocked about when we talk about, well, how can we improve election security in this country? Again, while a huge percentage of voters are covered by maybe the top 100 jurisdictions in size, the other 3,000 election jurisdictions in this country are much more shoestring. And a lot of them are using operating systems that are not supported anymore or have known vulnerabilities that haven't been patched. In some cases, they're using upgraded software and they're not patching it. These are simple things that jurisdictions need to be doing. And I'm not going to blame the election officials. I will say, in many cases, we know from a couple of surveys that the Democracy Fund has done, the average age of people who are in these jobs, their technological literacy is not that high. They are not going to be able to do it themselves. So they need some assistance either from their county jurisdictions, but there needs to be a focus on that, and that's pretty important. And that can go a long way to helping secure our election process. Yep. And the final one is providing updated guidance on securing election infrastructure in light of coronavirus. David talked about this a little bit. My opinion is states are moving towards more vote by mail. They're obviously going to have some sort of in-person voting. That's going to vary what that's going to look like. I know that the trend towards voting by mail has been on an upward trajectory for a long time, and so we always expected 2020 to be a record year, if you want to call it a record year, for vote by mail. But it's gonna be way higher than we ever imagined, and that's going to be with or without any policy changes that states make. I know states are considering various things, either from going all vote by mail, sending out the absentee ballot request forms to every voter, just to making it allowable. There's a whole spectrum of options, and we can talk about those in more specificity in the questions. But there's going to be more vote by mail, and a lot of jurisdictions across the country don't have a lot of experience with vote by mail. They don't have huge percentages of voters using it historically, and so they're just going to have some scaling concerns, and there's some threats there. So I think that with that, David, should we just open up to questions, or how do we want? Or you want to do the conclusions, David?
No, I think I know I went a little over, Matt, on my end, so I appreciate your bit on that. I just want to add that I really appreciate Matt and his team, right, help make this a really, really terrific report, right? And the Bipartisan Policy Center, frankly, has been critical in, frankly, moving a lot of the big election reforms that we've seen sort of come across, going across the country, right? They've helped carry the reforms from the Presidential Committee on Election Administration and a whole host of other things. But no, I think I'll open it up to questions as long as that's okay with you, John.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. If folks have questions, if you could please type them into the chat. There is a chat button generally at the bottom of your screen. If you have a toolbar, big thing that says chat, you can post them to everyone. You can send them directly to Ion, Y-I-O-N space Y.
No, post them to everyone. That way the host can see them too.
All right, perfect. So do post them to everyone. And guys, first of all, thank you very much. Fantastic presentation. And let's jump into questions. Ion, do you have any queued up already?
Only a couple. So the biggest question is, what can people watching this and reading the report do to actually make some of these steps happen? How do you approach officials? What can you do as an ordinary citizen to make this go?
I'll take a first crack at that. Matt may have a couple other ideas as well. So, obviously, I think it's really important. Right now we have a situation where Congress is considering another coronavirus aid package, right? And I think one of the interesting questions is that the stumbling block last time obviously was with the Senate. It's clear that there will need to be some Senate support, particularly from Republicans. And so I think for those folks who have senators, senators in their state who may be either on the fence or had been opposed previously, obviously I think being able to lobby them is one piece. I think the second thing that can be sort of helpful here, is being able to take this report in some respects and being able to ask your local, or in many cases the state official, and being able to walk through and verify whether or not they're doing these practices. I think in many cases, this isn't about playing gotcha, This is about, I think, highlighting some really good practices that can be done fairly quickly. And in some cases, these are practices that not everyone's aware of, Matt made a really good point earlier about sort of this .gov bit. We know that there are some jurisdictions that just didn't know about .gov even as recently as the Iowa caucuses, for example. And we know that Secretary of State Paul Pate, for example, has been willing to fund, in spite of the fact that .gov doesn't cost much money, he's willing to actually back counties who say that they can't afford to pay to transition to .gov. And so I think being able to take this report and being able to walk through with folks and verify whether or not they've got these things in place, right, I think is helpful. And then obviously for those things they've got in place, great. Obviously for those that they don't, right, that's where obviously having some additional funding could be really helpful. I don't know, Matt, if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I do think, honestly, at this point, it's gonna be a little limited, right? I mean, I think election officials are fairly overwhelmed. A lot of them are trying to transition to wholly new election processes during a presidential election year, something that no one recommends doing, but they don't have a choice. So they really, the best thing they can have right now is an influx of money to do more of what they're doing. But the other thing I'll say is, one of the things that I've always been advocating for citizens to do is to volunteer time. A lot of these things that they want to do to make voting accessible this fall are still going to require a human element. You know, I know that a lot of them are, and they, for a good reason, they are planning on doing in-person voting to some scale, to some effect. It's not going to be everything, most likely. They're going to have to do some consolidation. And a lot of them have been sued to maintain a huge number of polling places. That's all fine and good. But what I've been saying is that election officials are not magicians. They cannot conjure up poll workers. And if they don't have the poll workers, they can't provide the polling places. And so if we want to make sure that the elections are secure, that they are fair for everybody, they're going to need some people.
Okay, next question. What's the estimated cost? What's realistic given Republican opposition? What are the two or three most realistic and important proposals we could tackle first?
So Matt, I don't know if you want to talk about, I know BPC put out I think put out a number in a blog post. That we can work from there.
So the number we put out was mostly on the transition to vote by mail. So very early in the coronavirus, as this was called, all unfolding back in March, we realized pretty early on that states were going to be ramping up vote by mail. And so what we did was we made some back of the envelopes kind of calculations. And the number we put out there was about $1.5 billion. Now, what we also said at the end of that post, to give ourselves a little bit of an out, was we have no idea what the real cost is. We were pretty sure it was 1.5 was going to cover it. And then what we proposed was, if the states didn't spend it by the end of this year, it would revert back to the Treasury. And so give them a big enough blank check, make them use it this year, and that'll work. But you know, right now in the House bill for CD4, the coronavirus fourth relief package includes $3.6 billion. Now the House bill also has, I have no idea, I haven't counted them, a huge number of requirements, and quite honestly, many of which are not implementable on the time frame that the House Democrats have laid out. You know, for example, states that don't have early voting right now are not going to be implementing 7 days of early voting, but that's required in the bill by November. So, you know, I do think the best thing, and I won't say which three things are most important, but what I will say is right now, every jurisdiction has needs. They know best what they are. And so I think that the best we can do at this point in the process is to get them another influx of money as quickly as possible, because we do know that when they spend money, there's a long time frame from getting that money in their door to putting it out to vendors, because they have to go through a whole lot of hoops. David?
No, I think Matt's right on the nose on that. I'll just add that, and Matt touched on this, right? FY18 and FY20, right? I think it was, right, we talked about somewhere in that 800 million roughly, right? The coronavirus funding was another 400 million, right? Matt may be able to speak a little more to, right, why it keeps being around $400 million each time, right? So, but in terms of the realistic piece, right, if there's funding that comes in, right, if past is prologue, that could be, right, you know, on the realistic side. You know, Matt and I have gone back and forth on this. I'll just share briefly. Obviously, right, I've seen glints, right, obviously Senator Blunt from Missouri being the example who sits on, right, and is the presiding member of the Rules Committee, but it's a slog right now, and otherwise I echo Matt's points. John, do you just want me to take the next ones as I see it here?
Yeah, go ahead. The next one.
Yeah.
The next one I see is, sorry, 1 second, is what should be done about the long-term impact of states and localities rushing back ballot marking devices into service in spite of serious concerns about their verifiability in practice?
All right. Can you repeat that question one more time, John? You went out a little bit there to me.
It's basically states and localities are still adopting BMDs at a great speed. What's to be done about that? Is there anything in your proposals that addresses that or should be addressing that at this point in time?
Yeah, there isn't anything in our proposal here that addresses that. I think, this paper really was about, right, what we thought could be achievable between now and the 2020 presidential election, right? At this moment, we did not include, right, the procurement of voting equipment. We obviously, folks have basically made their decisions about what equipment they're going with at this point in time. Obviously, there are some folks who have spoken about, right, what kinds of precautionary measures one could take depending on the type of voting equipment that you have, right? There's obviously something the University of Michigan put out, right, recently on that, but that wasn't covered in this report.
Okay, next question then. In 2016, a presidential commission on election integrity was formed with Chris Kobach leading. One of the first actions was try to create a national voter registration database. Do you have any ideas why?
I mean, I'll say first that was 2017. Want to make sure that it was done during the Trump administration. I mean, I don't know why. I have no idea why. But I will say we have not something akin to this, but we do have a nationwide program that's been run by the states, been created by the states to share voter registration information across state lines. I think that, part of maintaining your database is keeping the list clean. I do think that states do need to perform, required list maintenance. It's required by the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. And there hasn't always been a good way to do that. Previously, before this interstate compact was formed, which is called ERIC, it's the Electronic Registration Information Center. Although I think they just go with ERIC now. There are like 30 members at this point. It's voluntary, it's run by the states, the federal government isn't involved. And what they do is on a regular basis, they are comparing all of the DMV records and the statewide databases against each other for two things. They're checking for duplicates, both in-state and across state lines. But they're also looking for what they call EBUs, eligible but unregistered voters. And states then reach out to those voters in their jurisdictions to try to get them registered. So I think that's a great compromise. And the reason for doing that is just to keep your list clean and accurate.
Sorry, list is getting longer. How do you influence your local board of elections? Given that this particular board doesn't respond to the public, gives inaccurate information, it does not believe there's a problem with elections security.
I've served as so I obviously can't speak to the questioner's sort of specific jurisdiction. I can, say that I've been a former state and local election official before coming in as the ASD's Election Integrity Fellow. I was the elections director, right, for Ada County, Idaho, which includes Boise and its environs. And I think, I think one of the things that was, I think there were a couple of things that were really important, right? Number one, I think, often, not always, but there were election offices, right, that often could be, that you could arrange and reach out to and be able to schedule appointments to be able to tour an election office, find out more about their operation, and during the course of those kinds of conversations, be able to raise some questions with folks, right? So that one, everyone, you could have a better understanding, voters could have a better understanding of what was going on, and election officials obviously could be aware of something if they weren't already aware of, right, a vulnerability or something they ought to be, right, more knowledgeable about. I found that was sort of something that was really, really helpful. I think another thing that was, also helpful as well was, many election officials often sort of had, right, a general email address or a general sort of Twitter account where they took questions. And I know I had that in Ada County where you could take questions from the public on any number of issues. And we often had that kind of thing, right, to complement FAQs that we had on our website. And, we took questions on all kinds of topics and tried to turn them around and answer them as best as we could because we thought it was transparent and we thought it was generally helpful and productive. Those were two things, at least as a former local and state election official, I found helpful.
Is there value to trying to go past them or around them if they're being difficult? Would you try talking to people at multiple levels?
So, I think obviously the first place is to be able to reach out to sort of a local election officials. Obviously, if folks are making a good faith effort, right, and you're not getting sort of cooperation, right, then obviously there are other entities in play that can be of help, right? Matt alluded, of course, to the fact, right, that the chief election officer in each state, right, in 40 of those states is the Secretary of State, right? That's obviously, right, can be a valuable resource. There are, of course, other advocacy and nonprofit organizations that often have good relationships and are knowledgeable about elections on the local level, and those can be valuable resources as well. And so, I think obviously that's something that hopefully doesn't happen too often, but where it does, whether it's reaching out to the state or being able to sort of talk with groups that maybe have decent relationships and being able to sort of work through how best to handle it would be a couple ways I think about handling it.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll add to that is, of course, I never assume that election officials, boards of election, don't want secure elections. And, especially we've seen a lot of transitioning away from the DREs, the direct recording electronic voting systems, the computerized voting systems that have no paper trail. Everyone knows that that's a good thing to do. I mean, I really think there are very few people left who don't realize that. The fact of the matter is your county election office doesn't have unilateral control to change that. Sometimes it's state law requires, it's just funding. So, some of that is, beyond their ability. That's why I think David's right. In those cases, going a little higher makes sense.
Yeah, a minor point I want to add there is I've heard and read from several places that basically go to the people who will work with you. If your local officials will work with you, but they need funding, then you can say, hey, we would like to fight for funding on their account. If your local officials are being difficult, but their Secretary of State is friendly, go to the Secretary of State and ask them what you can do about it. Push in all directions. There's also an answer from one of our participants about how to proceed further, which I'll just read out. Here in Philly, we have a group called Protect Our Vote, and we have been banging heads with the city commissioners who, for political reasons, selected the EVXL machine. With the pandemic, they have pivoted to vote by mail, which is what we asked for initially, hand-marked paper ballots. We've been working on them on a weekly basis to get as many voters as we can to apply for a mail-in ballot. This may be an option for other localities who have BMDs.
I mean, yeah, I'll say certainly yes, it is. Of course, localities that have the BMDs certainly recently spent money on that, right? Because those are relatively new technology. So if they've just bought those, my guess is that, again, it's not going to be the Board of Elections. It's going to be the supervisors of the entire county that have put a lot of money into those things. I don't think they're going to be getting rid of those anytime soon.
Okay, let's see. I think we're mostly out of questions. One of the bigger questions was how would you prioritize your 20 if people are going to get started with what are the low-hanging fruit?
Sure. I want to include, Matt may have a couple of thoughts as well on this. Part of the reason that we didn't necessarily sort of prioritize them, right, obviously, is depending on where you sit, right? Some states and localities are in different places on these things. Whether you have multi-factor authentication or whether you have .gov, whether or not you have a backup paper poll book in the event that your electronic poll book goes down. And so, on its face, there are some things that we think are low-hanging fruit. Matt alluded to the .gov site, right, which is not cost prohibitive, which an increasing number of folks are trying to do. But I think, what I think is really important, right, is, two things. One, seeing these collectively, I think helps make the case for why there needs to be more, among other things, more money from Congress, right, to states for securing the 2020 presidential election. And then obviously, I think in many of these cases, it either can be going on somebody's local or state election official's website, or by reaching out to election officials, you can very quickly, in some cases, be able to sort of verify whether or not this is something they have or they haven't yet gotten. And I do want to sort of let Matt, to Matt's point, some of these things, a couple of these things may be more challenging to do, obviously, between now and November, particularly, right, I want to emphasize, if you don't have additional funding, right? But I think, again, right, what this is about is being able to sort of, right, verify at the state level in many cases whether this is something you've already got, right? If you don't, if you can get additional, if states can get additional money and they don't already have a chief cybersecurity election officer, right, to oversee cyber training, to help conduct vulnerability assessments, right, to be a go-between between local, state, and federal officials, that can be really, really sort of helpful.
Okay, a couple more questions. One is about whether whether it's too late to actually do vote by mail at this point. I realize it's a complex question with a lot of details. I think just a rough sense of how that plays out, depending on how prepared you are, would be.
Yeah, I mean,
at
it's
least
definitely not too late. I mean, like I said earlier when I was first beginning my remarks, I do think regardless of policy changes, there's going to be more vote by mail this fall than we've ever seen before, by far. I think it's going to top 50% in many states that have never seen more than 10 or 15%. So I think we're going to see a huge percentage. So the question is, how do you do it well? And there's a couple different options. States, we've seen states like Michigan and Iowa and Georgia and West Virginia proactively send out applications for absentee ballots to all voters. The idea here is spreading out the process. Much like we tried to spread out the curve of the coronavirus, right? We didn't want everyone getting sick all at once because that was going to overwhelm the system. We need to do the same thing with the absentee ballots. Having people request them over a longer period of time, you can serve and you can service the same amount of voters without hitting your level where you can't service anybody. What we saw in Wisconsin during their primary back in April, a huge number of voters, again, these are not voters who are conditioned to using absentee ballots, requested those ballots very late in the process. They still met state law, but because the systems in Wisconsin are set up for like 6 or 7% absentee ballot usage in a regular election, it could not handle 50%, and people just didn't get their ballots in time. So I think one of those things about spreading out the curves, spreading it out is good. I don't think you're going to see too many states proactively mailing out ballots to everybody. 5 states do that now. California has committed to doing it for the fall, but I haven't heard of many other places even considering it. California already votes about 60% vote by mail already, so it wasn't a huge lift for them. For many other states, that's just impossible. And places like Maryland, where they did do something like that, they've had a lot of problems. So I don't know if we're going to skip for the fall. So I really think it's going to be on the application process, and how they manage that and how they spread out the request is going to be key in how well it works.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I just want to briefly add on Matt's answer because I think that's exactly right. When we think about vote by mail, just so folks are clear, there are 3 ways in which it happens, right? Often through a condition-based, right, process. We have to have an excuse, which is now very few, right? An application itself, or automatically, as Matt pointed out, having a ballot being sent. One of the things, just to sort of, I think, touch on it, is to transition to automatically sending out mail ballots. And there's a political piece, but it's logistically very challenging. I'll just give a couple quick examples, right? One is the ability to keep that list and keep track of everyone who moves to another county, another state, right? It sometimes doesn't get caught. But I'll also point out that even during the coronavirus, we've seen a lot of people that for one reason or another aren't living, right, in the place where they're registered to vote, right? That's sort of one of the really challenging things about the pandemic. How are you going to sort of make sure you capture those people as well? So just to sort of underscore Matt's point there.
Okay. Do you folks have time, a few more minutes for a couple more questions? Because they're popping up.
Sure.
Is it possible for outsiders or NGOs to help fill a funding gap for local officials? Be sanitizers, postage?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple groups out there that have either been in existence for a little bit or have sprung up since the coronavirus pandemic. There's one group, Business for America, BFA. They are trying to organize a bunch of, pretty well-known large companies to provide some of these to jurisdictions. And there are a bunch of other groups that are trying to provide direct services to election officials and have been for a while. I've had some meetings, I've facilitated some meetings from my organization between election officials and these groups. And I think that there are some concerns, some real concerns about it. They certainly want the materials. However, companies, even though they may say they're bipartisan, they're nonpartisan, whatever they want to call themselves, a lot of companies out there have a perspective on things. And I think jurisdictions get nervous taking it from a company. For example, if Walmart wanted to give it to only right-leaning jurisdictions, or if Hobby Lobby wanted to give money, or if on the other end of it, it was Patagonia wanted to give something only to Democratic counties. That's where I think it's going to make some people a little nervous. But I think there's a way to do it, and there are some groups out there.
Yeah, and I'll just add, 'cause this is a little less direct to Matt's point, and I won't do this too much, Matt, I promise, but is that I do think there's a place for civil society to be helping on the voter outreach side. I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting is we saw in the run-up to the 2016 election, we saw that there were communities of folks that were susceptible, right, to dis and misinformation. And we know, right, in the pandemic, right, that there are folks who are uncertain, right? They're uncertain about, right, and they're looking for answers in trusted sources. And this goes, back to Matt's point about trusted 2020 and about having trusted sources of information with state and local election officials. But as a former state and local election official, I can tell you, your ability to get out your message to everybody, right, by yourself is impossible, right? And having folks, right, who can help in particular reach those susceptible communities to mis and disinformation can be really, really helpful, so that, if there are changes to election processes, and of course, we're probably going to see a much different voting experience for many voters than maybe in any previous presidential election, right? If there can be partners to local and state election officials on getting out that information, that could be really, really helpful as we get closer.
I don't know if you can name groups off the top of your head in this context, but are there ways to find out who those groups are and who's trustworthy on the topic of doing that kind of outreach?
I'd have to think about it and get back to you. I'm always, number one, let me think about it and get back to you. I'm always sort of a little loath for some of the reasons that Matt sort of laid out right before. But I do, if I can find groups that I think are sort of trying to do that for this election cycle right now, I'll certainly keep that in mind. One org that I think did it when I was in Ada County, and I think enjoys pretty good bipartisan cred, so I'm not going on too much of a limb when I say this, is the League of Women Voters. I think in many cases has sort of tried to do, right, has partnered with, I know they did it in Ada County in Idaho. Boise probably is a little more blue than the rest of the state. Obviously, Idaho is sort of reddish, but, being able to, in some cases, help get out, right, information about elections, about the who, what, where to vote, right? Particularly when there were sort of, in some cases, last minute changes, right? That was a really sort of helpful partnership.
There's a question about the status of the post office and how it's likely to affect things. Lots of people are worried about the status of the post office. I'm unclear on whether there's actually really a question or not, but we'd like to hear what you think the odds are of this post office not having funding.
I mean, certainly, I won't speak to the funding specifically. I mean, I do think a lot of this is political gamesmanship going on in Congress right now and with the White House. The post office will be around by November. I'm pretty confident in that. There are far too many reasons why Congress and the president can't let it fail. But I still have concerns about people relying on the post office for everything. Many people, probably not this group, but many people, have somewhat old-fashioned views about how fast the post office delivers mail. Those service standards have gotten worse over the past couple years. I mean, not worse. I mean, we get what we pay for. And so I think as we're seeing a lot more jurisdictions going to vote by mail, we have to remember that service standards for first-class mail are around 5 business days. So when people are mailing things out, both to voters, getting things back from voters, there's a long period of time that you need to make that happen well. My biggest fear, one of my biggest fears, because I have a lot of biggest fears with this election, is that you're going to see a huge percentage of people who are voting by mail for the first time or intending to vote by mail for the first time, requesting those ballots late, either not getting them or getting them within the window in which it's too late to mail it back, and not knowing how to get that ballot back to their local election official. And that's my bigger fear than the post office not being there.
Okay, just scanning to make sure that didn't miss anything else. I've pushed aside some questions from us, the group that you Secure Elections Network, because I figure we can ask you afterwards. But I just want to make sure I didn't miss anybody who's on the call. I don't think so. If anyone thinks that I've missed a question, please post it again. But I think we've actually run through our list. Over to you, John.
All right. Thank you, especially to Matt and Dave, Matthew and David. However you guys prefer it, the long formal version, the short. I hope both. But that was fantastic. Thanks, Leon, for facilitating the questions. So we will post the recording, and we also, just a reminder, again, we're going to have another webinar in this first of two series about protecting the 2020 presidential election. David is going to join us again, as well as Brett Schaefer, his colleague. And they're going to talk about social media and the election. So stay tuned for that one. We will send out info about that. And Stephanie, Jan, or any leadership from Secure Elections Network folks, would you guys like to share any information, announcements, or thoughts?
Well, I would like to, it's Stephanie. I would like to first say thank you to David and Matt. I really appreciate your time this evening. I'm sorry we've gone over time. I promised you an hour and we're at an hour and 10 minutes. I thank you so very much. And to the other people, yes, the next webinar is tentatively June 28th at 5 o'clock, and that's going to touch on social media's impact in the upcoming election. So another very important topic. And with that, gentlemen, go kiss your children good night, and thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks,
Thank you
Brad.
so much.
Thanks, everybody.